This is chapter 5, section 3, the rights of women and minorities. So, women's suffrage. After the Civil War, leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony started to form the National Women's Suffrage Association. So, what is women's suffrage? That's the right for women to vote in elections. So, progressive women believed that as American citizens, women had the right to vote according to the Constitution. Equality, right? And some women would even get arrested for attempting to vote because they felt that adamant like that was their right, but they would get arrested if they tried to vote in elections. In the late 1800s, women first received the votes in the United States in the western states such as Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. And the reason for this was what pioneer women worked alongside men to build farms and cities. And it just seemed right that these women would also be allowed to vote in states because of their contribution. They were doing everything the men were doing, and they just firmly believed that women should have the right to vote too. It was a hard life out west, and wasn't had didn't have high population, so women always had the right to vote out there. Wyoming, when tried to become a state, um, the United States was trying to force them not to let women to vote in their local and state elections, but Wyoming said that they wouldn't join the United States unless they would allow the women to vote in the local and state elections, and the United States did. Like I said, they were like in these states they were allowed to vote in the local and state elections, but not in the national presidential elections. So they're struggling from like the late 1860s all the way to 1900, and during this time, women still didn't gain the right to vote, but more support for women's suffrage across the United States was gaining traction. More than 5 million at this time in 1900, more than 5 million women worked outside the home. Although women were paid less, earning a wage gave them a voice in the community. Unfortunately, money gives you power. So more women that are working, they're doing their thing. They have more power, more say in the community. So after Elizabeth Cady Stanton died and Susan B. Anthony died, a new era of suffragists came into leadership. And a suffragist is a person who worked for women's rights or supported it. Carrie Chapman Catt led the strategy for women earning the right to vote. She was kind of like the leadership in getting women the right to vote. But not all women supported women's right to vote. The majority of women were really indifferent. They didn't care to vote or were against against women being able to vote. And some of the reasons is that politics were seen as a dirty game men played, and it wouldn't be proper for women to get into such of corruption and just the game of politics. And also, if women wanted to vote and get into politics, it was seen that they were imitating men instead of acting like women. Gender roles were big at this time. Men went out and worked. Women would take care of their kids. Like that was the gender roles, and it was almost offensive to some of them that were old-fashioned to try to make them do something that wouldn't adhere to the gender roles. At the time, the majority of women were trusted. They trusted their husband and father and brother to vote, and they would just say, "Well, we would just vote the women." Women that were against voting, like if we just voted, we would just vote for the same people our husbands or father would vote for. And if every woman did that, then it wouldn't really change the elections all that much. And the belief, you were just doubling the vote. So that was kind of some of the opposition to women's suffrage. So this is actually a pamphlet that was handed out. People that were against women's suffrage, because 9% of the women either do not want it or do not care. It would mean no competition. It would mean competition of women with men instead of cooperation. They wanted men and women wanted to work together. If you pit them against each other, that doesn't seem proper. 8% of the women eligible to vote are married and can only double, or annual. It just double the votes. It can be of no benefit to anybody. And the expense involved. In some states, more voting women than men will be placed in government under the petticoat rule. So it would be, they were afraid because there was more women than men that women might vote, against what the men want. So that wouldn't be great. What that they thought back then. So that's kind of some of the opposition. It's pretty fascinating that they really didn't want women to vote. These are some other anti women's suffrage. So they depict these. This one's really rough. He's like, at the suffragette meeting, you can hear some plain things and see them too. It's like, oh, all these suffragists are ugly women. That's why they want the right to vote. So that was kind of rough. And then the other thing is like, women can't. This is kind of depicting women can't go out and vote. Who's going to take care of the kids for an hour? Like the man can't possibly watch these kids for an hour. So it was one of those things that was kind of funny. So women's suffrage, as more states individually allowed women the right to vote in the local and state elections, congressmen began being pressured to allow women the right to vote in the national elections. Suffragist Alice Paul was very persistent and forceful in establishing the right to vote for all women. Alice Paul would actually picket in front of the White House, make her voice known, and even go on these hunger strikes. She would call President Wilson, begging him for her support. So there's a movie called Iron Jawed Angels. It's really good. If you ever get to see it, it's about Alice Paul and her struggle to receive the right to vote. And there's certain scenes in the movie that show her in the hunger strike, and she's actually arrested, and they actually have to force feed her milk and eggs because she won't eat. They like strap her down, and it depicts this in the movie. But yeah, it said had fasted for 78 hours. She literally wouldn't eat for great long times in protest of not being able to vote. President Woodrow Wilson in 1918 publicly supported the women's right to vote finally. Congress constructed the 19th Amendment of the Constitution giving women the right to vote. And for an amendment to be passed, 3/4 of the states have to pass the amendment individually. So on August 18th, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state and the one to have the 3/4 majority to ratify the amendment. The amendment was officially ratified. So it actually came down to one vote in Tennessee, and it was a young state senator, and before the vote, he received a letter from his mom telling him that you better vote for women's suffrage, and that kind of changed his vote, and his vote kind of towards giving women the right to vote. And then Tennessee voted to support the 19th Amendment, and then it became law. So now there's more opportunities for women, because back in the 1870s, most states refused to give women licenses to become doctors or lawyers. In 1877, it took that long. It was the first woman received a doctoral degree from Boston University. And by 1900, there were 1,000 female lawyers and 7,000 female doctors. So this is about the time where, it's a progressive movement, progressing through society, making changes from old ways. And then there's a crusade against alcohol. Alcohol abuse was prevalent after the Civil War. There was post-traumatic stress a lot of depression after the war. Men been through a lot, and then now they're working in these factories, and there's a lot of bars opening up. They said these cities are getting bigger, and the availability of alcohol in saloons are growing. Many factories had a saloon right by the factory. You know, Christian groups believe that this alcohol contributed to many of society's problems: abuse towards women, immoral behavior like gambling, cheating on their wife, indulging in prostitutes, and then, um, poverty was also contributed to the alcohol because men would spend all their money at the bar and spend it wisely. So, this temperance movement was created, which is the movement by Christians to ban alcohol because of the abuse it had on society. And it started to gain some traction. The Women's Christian Temperance Movement was established to ban all alcohol in the United States. Frances Willard was their president. And then this lady named Carrie Nation, a temperance movement leader whose husband actually died from alcohol, would enter saloons and start destroying barrels of alcohol with an axe. And that's why this picture she's destroying. She really looked more like that. She was an older lady. But yeah, these women, they were just nonstop trying to destroy all the alcohol in the United States. So finally, it was passed in Congress and by the states. It's the 18th Amendment, which enforced prohibition. And prohibition is the ban of sale and alcohol consumption. So is there, they must have found some, and now they're pouring all this looks like beer down the sewer drain. So, African Americans were also fighting for equality. Famous civil rights leader was Booker T. Washington. He was a former slave. He taught himself to read. He worked in the coal mines while attending school. He educated himself. He helped found the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama that taught African Americans industrial and agricultural skills. He believed through learning trades and skills, African Americans would earn more money and be able to demand equality in society. In the South, everything was still separate but equal, but it was separate but wasn't really equal. African Americans still had the worst of everything. So he believed in a patient approach to achieving this equality. If African Americans get educated, learn how to read, write, and they get better jobs, and then they would be seen as equals in societies. There was another civil rights activist, W.E.B. Du Bois. He was the first African American to receive a doctorate degree from Harvard University. Smart guy. Du Bois favored a very active approach to fighting segregation and racism. In 1999, he helped establish the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and that is still around today. Still doing work for the advancement of colored people, making sure equality is happening in the United States. And then there's fights against lynching. In 1890s, more than 1,000 African Americans were lynched. And lynching is the murder by mob. So what happened is, either by the Ku Klux Klan or a bunch of angry white people would, for whatever reason, if they think, a black person stole something, they would mob together and either hang them or beat them up in a mob fashion and kill them, these African Americans. And African Americans have a history of being victimized by lynch mobs. So in protest to these lynchings, African Americans would not shop at white American-owned stores. Black communities began running their own successful businesses, these having their own black communities, so they didn't need white American-owned stores because they weren't treating them right anyways. So this led to the establishment of black colleges that would further educate African Americans. They were having their own stores. their own black communities, so might as well create their own colleges. And a lot of them are still there today. So if you ever see HBCU, that's historically black colleges, Hillman University, um, a lot of these ones, Howard University, these are all historically black colleges that are still around today. That concludes chapter 5, section 3.